So we have a wonderful guest now for you this afternoon, Sinéad Burke, who is a world leader at this point in disability advocacy, education, cultural awareness, and also a fashion icon, as you can see from her fantastic, beautiful green suit that she has on today. Step aside so you can all get a view. Behold. And to interview her is Galway's own Eithne Verling, who's director of the Galway City Museum, one of the best regional museums in the country, wonderful exhibitions, fantastic holdings, previously worked with the Heritage Council. Eithne is one of our absolute favourite interviewers here at the festival. Some years ago she interviewed Kate Mulgrew, the star of, as I discovered to my shame afterwards, Starship Voyager. I kept talking about Starship Enterprise as the audience yelled at me, "It's Voyager!" which I couldn't hear because I was nuts and deaf at that point from exhaustion. So when I came down, John Crumlish said, "It's Voyager, you idiot." Anyway, Eithne did a wonderful job with that, and she will do a similarly wonderful job today with Sinead. So please welcome Eithne Verling and Sinead Burke.
Pouring myself a little water before we start. So thank you all for coming. It's great to see you here today, and it is my great privilege to be interviewing Sinead Burke, who is all the things that Katrina described and more. And I thought maybe we might jump straight in. Some of you may not be aware of the fact that Sinead has done an amazing TED Talk, which I would direct you all to. It's really a very inspiring piece, but it also has such a strong message about disability. And I think it's a great way to start because it really describes very clearly and compellingly the adversity that is to be faced by people with all sorts of disabilities. And one of the quotes from that TED Talk is that Sinead said was, "Design inhibits my autonomy and my independence." So we're just going to discuss that first, if we could, especially the piece about the coffee, I thought.
Sure.
Excellent.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It is really such a joy and a privilege. For accessibility reasons, I'm going to start with a visual description of myself. To those of you who see, you can already see who I am, what it is that I'm wearing. But my name is Sinead. I'm a white, cisgendered woman who uses the pronouns she and her. I am visibly disabled. I have dwarfism. I have brown hair that is typically a bob, but it's a bit longer at the moment, and we're not going to dwell on that for reasons that we won't allude to. And I am wearing a green suit that is so vibrant in its greenness that it really is a spectacle to behold. And I am wearing that with a pink silk shirt and cream heels, because it's a Saturday and I'm in Galway, and why not? But to answer your question, being disabled and being physically disabled, it has been part of my understanding since I was a child that I live in a world that was not designed for me. It is designed mostly for many of you, depending on where you sit on the spectrum of privilege. We design a world for non-disabled, white, cisgendered men. And that has been how we have designed the world since time immemorial. And that's fundamentally because the people who are making decisions about design designed it for themselves, as one would. And for me, when I think about disability, there's a brilliant advocate and IT designer called Kat Holmes. And she talks about disability being a mismatch between the individual and society. I don't consider my disability to be a burden. I'm very proud to be disabled. I wouldn't be the Sinead that I am today if I wasn't disabled. I would be an entirely different person. It is not my fault that I can't reach a cup of coffee. It is not my fault that I can't get on this chair without a footstool. Somebody designed this chair in this way, never thinking of me as a user or as a designer. And we can build people's agency, dignity, and independence by designing the world differently. But historically, our solution to disability has been providing cures, encouraging them to be inspiring, to overcome their challenges. Why can't we just redesign the world? Why must we place the burden on people to change who they are, to actually fit in with a space that suits very few of us. So my fundamental belief is that if we design the world differently, and not just physical design, because actually designing the world physically is pretty easy. You just need money, legislation changes, and an appetite to do so. I also think we need to culturally design societies differently, how we think about disabled people, how we think about people who are multiply marginalized. And if we change our design thinking around the world, my fundamental belief is that people will feel safe and have agency to be themselves.
Well, that's very powerful. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because it's so difficult for us to get those changes in some ways because of the way this one size fits all, and as you say, it's for white male, typically. But can you just speak a little bit about how it impacts you, say, even on your daily life? I thought, as I said earlier there about the cup of coffee. I mean, just the actual danger in a cup of coffee is so simple. If you could just maybe speak about that, and maybe just about the airport experience, just so that everyone would, I just think it explains it so well.
I'm 3 feet 5 inches tall, which is about 105 centimeters. And if you can just imagine being in my shoes, they're custom Ferragamo, you're welcome. It's a great pair of shoes to be in. You can't have the suit. My experiences day to day are based on that mismatch of design and human experience. So if I go to order a cup of coffee, the counter is high. And some of that is for ergonomics of the barista behind the counter to be able to do it without kneeling down, bending down. But again, that's making an assumption as to who the barista is and what their disability may or may not be, understanding that disability is visible and invisible. But for me as a customer, it's very difficult to be able to reach overhead because often we don't place a lid on the cup of coffee. When I was doing my TED Talk, I named a company that I have a difficult experience with in terms of the retail design of being able to access coffee. It has a green logo, it's American, might be familiar with it. I now have a consulting company called Tilting the Lens, and I work with them to change that design process. What we do is we pair disabled people with designers to rethink about who can access a coffee shop, both as a customer, but also really importantly as an employee. One of the brilliant learnings that we've had is that if we introduce wooden floors to our coffee shops, that supports and helps the deaf community because they can feel the vibrations in the wooden floors. In an era where social distancing is a legal mandate, knowing who's around you when you cannot hear them is something we can actually create with design. And if we design coffee shops to be better, we can increase that enormously. I also have a lot of challenges in the airport. I come through the airport using disability services, which is such an asset to any airport that we create that service, because being able to travel when it is safe to do so gives people such independence and agency. I come through the airport in a wheelchair because in security, I can't reach. And as you might imagine from the little you may know of me, I don't travel light. So being able to lift a suitcase from the ground to the conveyor belt within security is very challenging. Those who work in security can't assist me because there may be something in my bag. But again, this is not just the designing of the conveyor belt, but that's also a cultural design process that we have created training that is so grey and black and white that it doesn't allow for a human-first approach, which inhibits my agency. So design is something that we all participate in. And it may seem like you sitting here, well, I don't own an airport. Maybe you do. If you do, we should talk. There's many on the West Coast. How did that happen? Or maybe you don't own a coffee shop. But actually, in terms of that design is rooted in education. It's rooted in advocacy, and it's also rooted in thinking and process. And I don't doubt that each of you have an opportunity by which you can change how something is designed. Maybe it's even in your language and your vocabulary. So there is something that we can each do. That is both an opportunity, but also something that we're accountable for. So by thinking about these things in the grand scale of the airport or the coffee shop, it feels like something that's outside of our remit of control and power. But actually, we can all make those design changes right now.
And the other interesting thing about that, I suppose, is once you start thinking in that way, you know, you're actually generating a lot of empathy.
Yeah.
And empathy and kindness, I suppose, is so good for everyone. And so, you know, it benefits you personally. So it's a kind of it's a win-win situation, isn't it, to be thinking like that?
And when we think about inclusive design specifically, or if we think about accessibility, which is where a lot of my work is rooted in, I'm not asking you to do this for me. My ego's big, it's not that big. This is for everybody. Disability is the only identity group by which we will all participate in at some point in our lives. In the hope that we all get older, we are going to need universal design, because actually living in 3-story houses with stairs is not going to be functional for us as we get older. So creating bungalows is actually something that's going to create sustainable living and independence as we age. If you are a parent, how many of you have struggled with curbs and pathways, and now with outdoor dining, all of the tables that are on the route? Disability is a community that you will engage with, because you may go roller skating like my sister did, tumble and fall and break her arm. You can be permanently, temporarily inherit a disability. This inclusive design benefits everybody. And it also has great opportunities, even if we think about business for a second. So we were talking about the coffee shop example. I'm always interested, right, that if you and I were going for a coffee, we would say, start here in this theatre, and we would ask Google Maps, where's the closest coffee shop? If we're both using our phones, it would tell us that the probably closest coffee shop is an 8-minute walk away. We are not the same height. We do not walk at the same speed. My phone collects so much data on me, I'm not going to spend too long thinking about it. And yet it cannot customize that journey for me and say, actually, Sinead, it's going to take 11 minutes for you to walk. It's going to take Eithne 8. But actually, Sinead, if you walk 13 minutes, that next coffee shop has a low counter. Yeah. Well, you're going to come with me. And instead of a $3.50 transaction in an inaccessible coffee shop, we're both going to give the one that's designed for everyone 2 new customers.
Yeah, it makes total sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Can I move us on to another? I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, there are so many huge points in your life that are of huge interest, such as the World Economic Forum. So you were there as a cultural leader in both 2018 and 2019. Like, how does that come about? How did that happen?
I am a person who has both been in the right place at the right time, but works extraordinarily hard. I'm not going to sit here in front of you and pretend that it's all luck. That's not fair on the people who support me or the work that has to be embedded into it. But there's an element of being in the right place at the right time. I was speaking at a conference in Dublin, and the previous speaker had worked at the World Economic Forum. And she came off stage and he was like, you should go to Davos. Davos is this annual meeting that takes place in the middle of Switzerland. And if you are a political leader, if you are a company leader or a government leader, it's a central hub for all sorts of meetings and communications. And every year they say that they outwardly speak about the agendas of the year from a global context. But if anybody is a fan of the musical Hamilton, it is the room where it happens. And I know, niche reference. Thank you for laughing in the corner. We haven't got to Ted Lasso yet, I promise. Because it is where change can happen in an instant. That individual said to me, you should come to Davos. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I got to open up the conference talking about disability. There had never been a conversation surrounding disability at that level ever before. Why? Because nobody's disabled. So why would they think of talking about disability? Because what we know about identity more generally is that if not in your lived experience, within your family, within your workplace, within your community, it's just not part of our consciousness because we don't know what we don't know. So being able to embed a conversation surrounding disability rights and disability justice in a space like that was opportunistic, if nothing else. And getting to meet people who have power, who create change in an instant, was really educational for me.
And how did it, I mean, how did it work out? You know, do you feel like there was any kind of changes made, or how much did they take it on, you know, at the end of that?
When I first went to Davos. It was just after I had delivered a TED Talk. And I think so much of my thinking around change has evolved. I think when I was in my early and mid-20s, I wanted change to happen right now, because I believed people could. But actually, the only change that happens right now is for marketing. It's not really rooted in people. It takes time, resources, energy, and different types of people in the room to create the systemic change by which there are barriers in order to have that agency. What it did was that it started conversations. It created an awareness, which in the years that has followed has built the critical path to action and advocacy. But for me, the success is not in me just being part of those conversations, that it's about what can I encourage other people to do in their own areas or communities and other disabled people to be involved. So since then, Caroline Casey, who's an amazing disability advocate, also based in Ireland, had been to Davos and spoke about the Valuable 500, which has been a legacy piece of advocacy and action within the corporate space around disability change since. So I think the more we can have conversations and representation across the intersections of society and disability, the faster that change will meaningfully happen.
You were saying earlier as well that there's a pool of global leaders in this area, of which you are one. So I mean, you hear, for example, about Mary Robinson and the elders. So it's great to hear that there's a global pool of. Is it people with disabilities, or is it a wider context than that?
So one of the organizations that they have within the World Economic Forum is a Young Global Leaders, where every year they take a class of people who are working in non-profit, civil society, private organizations who are attempting to create change. And I had the great privilege representing Tilting the Lens to be one of the people in that class this year.
Wow, that was amazing. Now, you travelled to Australia as well, I understand, with a group of stakeholders, and you were looking at, which is great, at a multidisciplinary approach to disability, architecture, design, travel, education. What kind of forum was that, the trip to Australia?
I think when we think about design and disability, when we look at it from an Irish focus, it feels like we're the country with all the problems. But actually, this is a global issue. And even going to a space like Australia, we were in a very new part of Brisbane, a new part of the development. And part of my work there was able to bring disabled people, architects, designers, engineers, as you said. And actually, the conversation that began there was so fruitful in terms of the work that I've done since. Because so often when we think about accessibility, can somebody describe for me, what does a ramp look like? It's not a trick question. What colour is it? Grey. What's the material? Metal. Is it pretty? No. Is it clunky? It doesn't give you any sorts of pride, does it? And it's usually put out on the front of a building that's architecturally beautiful and stunning, or it's hidden around the back at the accessible entrance. And so much of that is because when we think about architects, when we think about engineers and designers, they think about accessibility within their design schooling for probably 2 hours in the 4 years of their curriculum. So many of our buildings are legally protected to not be made accessible. And that's actually due to a bias that we have about accessibility, because we believe it will take away from the aesthetics of the building itself. Which I don't believe is true, because we just haven't yet had an opportunity to reimagine what accessibility could look like. But also, what does that mean for us as a society when we say, oh no, but it'll make the building ugly? So we're just happy to let disabled people be outside. Are we really continuing to say that buildings need to be put forward instead of people? And that's banks, that's McDonald's. Look at the amount of heritage and architecturally protected sites we have in this country and how many people are excluded. So being able to do that work in Australia was giving an awareness to designers to think about the innovative opportunities and the design-led opportunities that exist if we reimagine accessibility.
Yeah.
It was good. I caused trouble.
Yeah. You also, you were quite close to a friend of yours in New Zealand then as well, I understand.
Oh yeah, me pal. Well, listen, if you're going to go to Australia, you might as well go across the water to New Zealand. I am very lucky to have been able to learn from extraordinary people, and particularly extraordinary women and those who identify as women. My first time to the Galway Arts Festival was probably about 6 years ago. I was attending a talk. It was Jo Ellison, who is now the editor of How to Spend It and the co-editor of the Financial Times Weekend. She was here speaking about fashion and business. And I interviewed her for my blog, which was this tiny little blog at the time. And I accosted her in the car park outside. And I was like, hello, I'd like to be friends. And I think I handed a thank you card to Enda Walsh, and I was like, that's for your wife. He gracefully accepted it. And I have been fortunate to have moments like that to learn from people, and one of them is Jacinda Ardern. We got to spend some time together in her office in New Zealand, and she just talked about the power of vulnerability within leadership. So often when we think about leadership, and for me, my background is in education and being a primary school teacher, we think about somebody who's authoritative. They're the boss in a suit, hence the suit. It's green though, so it doesn't count. It's not so patriarchal. We think about somebody who has a stiff upper lip. We think about somebody who has all of the answers. But that's not human. That's not realistic. And actually, not knowing has such power to it because it invites collaboration. It invites vulnerability and empathy in others. And I have taken those lessons with me and feel very proud to admit all that I don't know, because that's an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, but she is, and look at the amazing job she's doing, you know, through the whole COVID crisis as well. So she's shown excellent leadership. That kind of brings you, well, not, it doesn't really bring me, but where I want to bring you next is to the Met Gala and Gucci. So you're wearing head to foot in Gucci, by the way, which is, if you can see the little sign here, it says Gucci and Sinead's name.
Just in case I forget. Or if I leave my jacket behind, they'll be like, oh, it's hers.
So how did you get invited to the Met Gala?
In 2017, I was awarded a Future Innovator Award from the Green Carpet Fashion Awards. It was based in Milan. And Marco Bizzarri, who's the CEO of Gucci, was presenting me with the award. Marco is a very tall man. I am not. And we had this wonderful conversation prior to the ceremony, where we were trying to figure out the juxtaposition of where he would stand, if I would sit, what it would look like. And we'd agreed that he would sit and I would stand and we would both be at eye level. Going back to where we were talking about vulnerability and leadership and collaboration, I was very enamored by his approach to this because he's the CEO of a $10 million company. And I accepted the award that night, never thinking any more of it. In the interim, based on that conversation that I had with him, I bought myself a pair of children's Gucci loafers from Brown Thomas in Dublin and thought that I was it. I went to the British Fashion Awards that December and Marco was being awarded this time himself. And I remember really embarrassingly going up to him and being like, look, I have to show you, lifted the dress, showed off the shoes that I bought. And he was like, great, I'm delighted for you. Thanks for the sale. I was thrilled with myself. In the February of the following year, I was invited to the Gucci fashion show for the first time in Milan during Milan Fashion Week. Wow. And I was asked if I would come and speak to the staff in the days before to talk about disability and the opportunity that exists within accessibility in fashion. It was an amazing conversation. And from that, they invited me to the Met Gala, wow, which is possibly the scariest thing that I've ever done. To give you a sense of what the Met Gala is, so the Met Museum in New York, the Met, and the only part of the museum that isn't funded by the museum is the fashion section, because fashion isn't art. I have my own thoughts on that. So in order to make sure that fashion was supported within the museum, Anna Wintour, who's the editor-in-chief of American Vogue, created this gala night to bring fundraising to the museum. That's how it started, the Met Gala. And the idea was that every year there would be a specific fashion exhibition on the night that it opened, which is the first Monday in May, they would host the Met Gala. It's on Monday coming this year. That's how it started. It has since become a platform by which is a gateway into the industry. So to give you some very kind of boring dynamics, you don't get in if Anna Wintour doesn't approve you, right? Tickets are expensive. And usually what happens is that a brand or a company or a designer will invite guests and take a table. My background in fashion is not anything formal. I became obsessed with the fashion industry when I was in my teens because I have spent my life being observed. As a little person, as a woman with dwarfism, I live in a very public body that everyone has thoughts and opinions on, and usually jokes about. I can't control that. I have no agency over how people interact with me in public. But when I sit in front of you wearing a custom green Gucci suit, I'm inviting you into my world. I'm introducing myself to you in a way that fashion gives me a vocabulary. I understood the power of the fashion industry by which to do that, but when I was 16 years old, this suit didn't exist. So I was doing it with whatever I could get myself access to, but it was at a very minimum. So instead, my way into the fashion industry was through education. And I would sit around the dining room table every evening and say, "Ma'am, what do you think of Marco Gabbetti leaving Burberry as CEO and going back to the Ferragamos? Isn't it a bit strange that right in the middle of his contract he would leave? Now, I know he wants to be closer to home to the Italians, but I mean, they've just ousted somebody and she was the first female CEO of Ferragamo and now she's gone. What do you think that means for gender in the industry?" My mother is an amazing woman. She has no interest in Marco Gabbetti, no offense to him. And there was nobody I went to school with who had an interest in fashion in the way that I did, because they didn't have to. They didn't have to care about the system because they could access the trends. So I used to write about it on the internet. And in many ways, the internet was possibly a safe place back then because it didn't matter what I looked like. Nobody knew. What mattered was my argument, my ability to construct a sentence, and my opinions, thoughts, and questions. So my journey in the fashion system began through that, and I wrote about the Met Gala every year. Who wore what? What did it mean if they went to that brand? Was there a brand ambassador contract on the way? My goodness. They were in Calvin Klein last year, now they're in Prada. So to be there, in a place where I had spent my life using fashion as a tool in which I was giving people permission to observe me, felt overwhelming. Because I was the first little person in the world to attend the Met Gala. It's a flight of stairs, is the public symbol of it, which is literally a vehicle for inaccessibility. There's an accessible entrance, but there's no photographers there. Again, who's welcome? In the days before, we did an audit of the stairs, making sure that I could do it independently. And I felt so overwhelmed by my inability to represent every disabled person, my inability to represent every little person. I could only represent myself. But I knew, having had 3 decades of being observed, that the rest of the world would make assumptions, that I was there for everyone else. The morning of the Met Gala, I was violently unwell. I rang my dad. "I don't think I can go." He was like, "Sinead, it's a party in the museum. You'd be grand. Have a nice time." I was like, "Oh, thanks very much now for that vote of confidence. I really appreciate it." The night itself feels like a blur now, but for me what was important was what came after it. So I wore this amazing black velvet full-length dress with ruched sleeves and silk bows across my chest. And for me, I did not want it to be just a moment, but to be a movement. Because success isn't success if it's just me gaining access. So that dress then went on to live in the Gucci Garden Museum in Florence and was on display for over 2 years on a custom mannequin for people to be able to look and learn from. And from that, I was then invited by Marco Bizzarri, the CEO of Gucci, to join the Global Equity Board. So I sit on the board of Gucci, which is the most absurd thing to be able to say. Hence the suit. And I lead a strategic ambition of creating opportunities for disabled people at Gucci.
Wow, that's...
Across all of regions. And the reason why for me that's important is because when I was blogging about fashion, I thought success was going into a store and being able to buy a product that's adaptive. Being able to buy a product that was designed with disabled people in mind. Because when we talk about disability and when we talk about inclusion, we often talk about the business case to convince people to let us be part of your world. So there are statistics like there are 1 billion disabled people in the world, the size of China. We have a spending power of 1.7 trillion US dollars per annum. Bring in our family and friends, it's almost 8 trillion US dollars. Which you have CEOs then going, sorry, how much money did you say they have to spend? I understand why people are interested in that, but the statistics that we don't talk about is that 50 to 70% of disabled people are unemployed. So my strategic ambition at Gucci is not about creating product, because accessible product would only exist for as long as it is marketable or profitable. If we don't uplift disabled people in employment, who's buying the product? And we only get one shot at this to make it successful because they will never do it again. So my role is about creating employment opportunities for disabled people in an international company.
What an extraordinary company. I think we'll all be going out buying Gucci.
Ah, they're grand. Tell them I sent you.
That whole fashion piece brings us, of course, then to Vogue and your
Yes.
relationship with Edward Enninful, who is the editor-in-chief of British Vogue. You're the first little person to be on the cover of Vogue. I think you shared it with Jacinta, your friend.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So maybe just a little bit about that, because you are a contributing editor, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, to Vogue. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was telling you earlier about sometimes the right place, the right time, if I am in a position to give any advice, it's to always have the conversation. I was sitting at a Burberry fashion show, probably about 4 years ago. The seat beside me was empty. The doors were about to close, and somebody ran in. And I turned, and it was Edward Enninful. He'd just been appointed editor-in-chief of British Vogue and is the first black person to ever do so. I texted one of my very good friends and was like, Edward Enninful is sitting beside me. Like trying to hide the WhatsApp from his view. They text me back and were like, don't let him leave without saying hello. So of course, I couldn't focus at all on the fashion show because I was like, what am I going to say? I need a script now. The show ends. He gets up to leave. I tug on the sleeve of his jacket like a child. And I was like, hello, my name is Sinead. It's really nice to meet you. You're doing brilliant work as regards to representation and diversity in fashion. I'd love to have a conversation with you about disability and accessibility in fashion. It would be great to chat. As you might imagine, he was completely overwhelmed by the word vomit that I had ejected at him. But I had just had 15 minutes of a fashion show to rehearse it. To his credit, he said, would love to chat. Here's my card. Which meant that I was then going back and forward from Ireland to London and meeting with him in Vogue House, and we had several conversations. He then included me in the top 25 most powerful women in the UK and Ireland, and all of a sudden I'm standing beside Dua Lipa doing a fashion shoot, and I was like, this is gas. She's very nice. Very tall. And after that, I was walking down just a street just off Georgia Street in Dublin, and I got this email. It was like, Sinead, Edward would like to talk to you. And I was like, oh God, what have I done? What have I posted? And I said, sure. And they said, can he ring you? And I said, sure. And I stood in a doorway, just like up from the Music Man. And I was like, hello. He was like, so Sinead, we're putting together the September issue of Vogue. The September issue is the biggest issue of Vogue. It has the most amount of advertising, but it's also the starting of the season within fashion. It's the most important issue. He said, we're putting together the September issue of Vogue. And I was like, lovely. Great, thanks for updating me. And he was like, so, you know, for this issue, we're putting together 15 women who we believe to be forces for change. Lovely. We want to know if you'd like to be one of them. Sure. Why not? That is not how I responded. But for me, the power in that was it not being about me. Because I knew immediately the importance of that in terms of historical timeline. I now hold the Guinness World Record for being the first little person on the cover of Vogue, which is a lovely thing, but it also frustrates me. Because why did it take until 2021 for a little person to be on the cover of Vogue? There was 12 issues a year in every jurisdiction, and there hasn't been a little person on the cover of any Vogue anywhere in the world. It's a lot of issues.
Yeah.
It's a lot of exclusion. And then to see the impact of it when it came out, of like young children who looked like me holding that magazine and sending me photos. I mean, my ego was out of bounds for about 6 months.
I must say they're extraordinary, the photographs of you. Is it Lindbergh is the photographer?
Peter Lindbergh, who has since passed.
Oh, did he really?
I'm fortunate to have worked with some amazing photographers, from Tim Walker, who has just the most extraordinary vision in terms of creativity, Peter Lindbergh and others. And we were talking earlier about being observed. There's nothing more intimidating, but sometimes when done right, empowering than having your photograph taken.
They're beautiful. It's worth going on Sinead. Well, Sinead has a great website, but there's beautiful photographs, black and white photographs. They really are very extraordinary.
There was a fan.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, you said somewhere that I read that you had an ambition from when you were a child or a teenager to be in the September issue of Vogue. I mean, it's unbelievable that came true for you, isn't it? And I just wanted to ask you, something else you said, I think in the TED Talk, is you said, I was a loved child. You're one of, I think, 5 siblings, is it? The eldest?
Yeah.
Your father is a little person?
He is.
But what I really wanted to ask you, and we mentioned this earlier, was that obviously has been a huge part of your courage, incredible courage and confidence. But so maybe you might just say something about, you know, that a lot of people with disabilities are on the inside. Like you have this extraordinary, you know, experience with your own family. A lot of people don't have that, and we don't see that disability at all. You know, so they're hiding it. Or so would you just like to maybe say a few words about that?
I am a loved child, and I still am. I turn 31 next week and would still consider myself to be a loved child. But it wasn't through my family that I am an extrovert. It's through the world. I've had to be an extrovert because people are uncomfortable around disability. If we look at the historic timeline, even just in Ireland, where it's within the lived experience of some of the people in this room where we institutionalise disabled people. We still do. But we did it more then. We took them out of the homes and the communities because we felt like families couldn't cope and that they didn't have the capacity for them. And whilst that was happening, we built a world without them, which is why so many of our places are not accessible. We then began to take disabled people out of those institutions back into communities, and our solution was through charities and the charitable model to provide services for them, not with them. We still have a discomfort around disability in this country. That's why we use terms like special needs or differently abled, because we can't bring ourselves to say the word disabled because we fear what that might mean for that person. I love the word disabled. It has such pride and community to it, and it's also legally protected because with the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, I have a right to dignity, I have a right to agency, I have a right to social inclusion. But because of that discomfort, I knew from the earliest of ages, being in the playground in school, that if I didn't make the effort to say hello to people, they may never make the effort to say hello to me. So that confidence had to be found. But I describe myself as an extroverted introvert because for those who know me most, I'm probably a bit more introverted than sitting on stage in a green suit. Because there's a performance to all of us, right? It's how we code switch. It's how we survive in the world. But I'm really lucky that I had a dad too who was disabled. But my mother is non-disabled and an extraordinary advocate and ally. When I was 7, my parents founded Little People of Ireland and built an organisation and a community voluntarily, and still do today, to create a network of people who look like me. And the difference that has made is huge, because I went into school when I was 8, when people would say to me, "Why are you so small?" And I'd say, well, it's not just me. It's my dad, it's Yvonne, it's Gina, it's Emma, it's Aoife, it's Nicole. There's nothing worse than feeling alone when you are different, because you already feel othered. But as you said, that sense of fostering of confidence and love doesn't exist in every home. Home may not be a safe space for some, in the way that school or work is not a safe space for others. But just to give you a sense, like, disability is a broad spectrum. In Ireland, it's about 1 in every 4 people. And that is only going to increase, because if you have long COVID, for example, welcome, you're now part of the disabled community. You know somebody who has cancer, they're part of the disabled community. You have anxiety, you are disabled, or can be. The disabled community is visible and invisible. And actually, some of my greatest challenges are because my disability is so visible. But I also don't have to come out. I have a litmus test, probably 40 seconds after I meet you, depending on how you react to me. I probably know if you're a person I want to be a friend with or a colleague with, based on how you react to something that I've had no control over. People with invisible disabilities, that's hard. They spend such a long time talking about and coming out, or the nervousness of having to come out, in the same way that the queer community often has to. There are challenges and advantages to both, based on how we design the world.
That litmus test sounds interesting. What does it involve?
I just stand there. Everybody else does the work and I observe. It's great.
Yeah, no, it sounds. Can you just say a little bit about your I suppose your work as a campaigner? I know you've worked with the Gardaí as well, and with the diversity section there. One of the things you talk about is how you can amplify voices and experiences. So do you do it mainly through the? I mean, you're doing it across so many different fora, but say, is your main your main organisation, is it through Little People of Ireland, or are there others?
There is brilliant organisations specific to little people in kind of every region, so whether that's Little People UK, Little People of America. I think my advocacy, or my appetite for advocacy, began in Little People of Ireland, seeing what my parents were able to foster and the other work that has happened. We have some amazing advocates in Little People of Ireland. I'm not sure if you saw the recent Paralympics with Nicole Turner, who has just come home with bronze, Mary Fitzsimons, who came 6th in hers, and not just in sport, but in all other domains and areas too. But a lot of my advocacy has been moved and rooted now in tilting the lens. And just from an individual perspective, I am curious by nature, and I often say things like, "And why?" It's a great question to ask. Some like, "The building's inaccessible." Why? Because it is. Yeah, but why? People don't have answers. Which means that you can help them find a solution. And I remember doing my Leaving Cert and wanting to be a primary school teacher and needing a good grade in Irish, and going into my Irish oral. And the first question that you usually ask is, "Inish dom fuadsa?" Tell me about yourself. I describe myself as a little person. I don't usually describe myself as a dwarf, but I will often say that I have dwarfism. Semantics of language is complicated and individual. But there was no word in the Irish language for me to describe myself as a little person to answer that first question. And I didn't want to make it up in the case that the examiner thought that I was speaking Gaelic incorrectly and marked me down. So for the first time in my adult life, I described myself as a dwarf and said, "Is Misha an navach, Tom in navach?" Which is it? I'm asking the Gaelic girl in the room, and she's like, "Don't ask me a question." Go on. Gur mé mad, is navach me. I clearly haven't practiced it since.
What's the word? Navach?
Navach.
Navach, okay.
So when I got a little bit older and began getting more comfortable with asking why and finding solutions, I emailed Fergus na Gaeilge, who was responsible for the Irish language, and was like, "Hello, my name's Sinead. There isn't a word for a little person in the Irish language. Could we create one? My suggestion is Dina Biog." And they came back and they said, "Yeah, sure. It's in the dictionary." And I think my advocacy is rooted in being able to observe and see where the gaps are, and then find and build the solutions to create them, and having the courage and the confidence and the pure boldness to be like, sorry, can we put a word in the dictionary? And they're like, just do what she wants. Yeah, put it in. And I'm being glib because it's far more work than that. But it's constant. It's continuous. You know, there was a film coming out next year called The Little People, about two people who are gnomes who live at the end of the garden, who terrorize a family. I was like, oh, can you imagine the promotional and the marketing campaign? The posters everywhere. A word that me and so many others have fought to build pride and community around. And all of a sudden we become just a noun by which other people feel afraid of. How that would set us back. So I emailed the film company. I was like, hello. It was described as a creature feature.
Oh my God.
So I emailed and was like, hello, my name is Sinead. Just a quick question. Am I the creature or the feature? They didn't have an answer. And the name of the film has changed. It's going to be different, which is good. There is so much work to be done.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, just because I'm conscious of our time. So you're going to be 31, you say, next week. So what does the next decade hold for you, would you say, in terms of challenges? And fashion interest?
I'd like to buy a house.
Okay.
That's very challenging.
Yeah.
When you're disabled and self-employed.
Yeah.
I would like to be able to move and to measure the shift from awareness to action. Because we have had so many conversations, disability advocates in general, around disability, access, inclusion, educating the masses about our right to exist. When will we not have to do that? When will we not have to almost apologize for who we are in order to exist and equitably participate? So what I hope to be able to see is an accessible coffee shop in 5 years. What I hope to be able to see is disabled people employed and thriving and being supported and set up for success, and a cultural understanding that disability is a spectrum, and that capacity is a spectrum, and that we have a greater understanding of accessibility being a vehicle for dignity, agency, pride, and beauty.
That's great.
We'll see. It's going to be a long 10 years.
We've about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions from anybody in the audience?
Oh, now it's on you to do some work.
Fashion questions? Yeah.
Hello. Oh, there's a microphone. What's your name?
My name's Bridget.
Nice to meet you.
In your book, Break the Mold, you say you introduced the sign for little person into Irish Sign Language. Do you know what it is? Because I'm not sure where to find it.
I will send it to you. Will you give me your email address at the end, or whatever way to contact you, and I'll send it to you?
Perfect.
So there's a brilliant project with this amazing deaf academic called Dr. Valerie Mahon, and she works out at DCU, and she has created this project called ISL STEM, because when we were talking about, say, even the Irish language not having more up-to-date identity-focused language, ISL and any sign language is the same, and she's doing great work about increasing that vocabulary, so I'll send it to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Go for it. You're all sitting there going, that'd be impolite to ask. It's fine.
One last thing I was going to ask you about was just about your shoes.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're Ferragamo shoes. Ferragamo. Ferragamo shoes. Yeah. So he designed them especially for you as well?
So I was sat next to the designer Paul Andrews at a dinner, and we were talking about shoes. I never got to meet my grandfather on my mother's side, but he had this great mantra where you should only spend your money on two things: a bed and shoes. Because when you're not in one, you're in the other. Now that goes against everything I've spent money on in my wardrobe. But shoes are really difficult. I'm a size 12 in the children's department. And as a primary school teacher, I would often find myself in a situation where I was wearing the same shoes as the children that I taught, which they loved. I did not. They were like, look, they light up. I'm visible as it is, thanks very much. And again, shoes being a symbol, particularly as a woman. And I said to him, we were talking about different kind of innovations and how technology could play a role. And I was trying to learn how the shoes were made. And I said, is there an opportunity for my foot to be scanned and 3D printed and for shoes to be 3D printed? Is that a process? And he explained that no, it's very kind of historic in how the shoes are made at Ferragamo. So Salvatore Ferragamo, who is the name over the brand, used to design shoes for Hollywood starlets. He realized what a success that was, came back to Italy and built a business. You have to have your whole foot cast. So I went to Florence and had my foot measured and cast, and these are custom. We then brought Ferragamo all the way to Little People of Ireland to measure and scan everybody's feet to see if there's a way in which we can amend the sizing chart for feet to see if there are similarities in between to be able to make the model customizable. I share this with the caveat of saying these shoes are expensive. But I also share it with the fact and say that, you know, I don't doubt somebody has a question that is about, so you're doing accessibility work, but you're working at a $10 billion company. How is that accessible? But you're too polite to ask, right? So I'm going to answer it for you. From my days of writing a blog, I understood that within the fashion system, influence is top-down. It is not bottom-up. And if we start this work of repositioning disability and accessibility at this level, the top will never be interested. But if we start it there, what we can do is create a blueprint to then open source it to make it financially accessible in time. But there are challenges, right? Because how do you work with a high street retailer to make something accessible for disabled people, empowering disabled people in the Western world, where it is more white, and disempowering the disabled people who are probably making it in different parts of the world? Ethics and moral compass are challenging. But if we can create the learning and the innovation in the spaces where there is resources to do so, that has to disseminate down. But it's also then about creating asks, right? It is not enough that there is just employment happening because there is a challenge with pipeline. How do we, in a university like this space, ensure that disabled people can access education and courses? But then we need to go a step further, right? Because how do they know that they can be designers? How many designers exist who look like them? So how do we start the conversation when they're 4 and 5 and say, you want to be a fashion designer? Great. You want to be a lawyer in a fashion company? Very boring. Great. We need to create that systemic change throughout, which is why I wrote Break the Mold. Thanks for reading up to that page. I'm not sure if you got all the way through. It's a slog.
That book was just recently published, wasn't it?
It was published last year.
Yeah.
That was my lockdown project, writing it at 4 a.m. in my family home. But it was the book that I needed to read as a child. And it was the book that I needed to read to my class when I was a teacher, telling children that they are enough as they are is something we don't do as a society. We, particularly as people move into teenage and adolescent years, are so consumed by changing to fit in. And in unintentional ways, we encourage it. And I just had a very explicit experience where I couldn't, which gave me an opportunity to hopefully light the path for others to stay true to who they are.
Well, that's a great way to end. What an inspiring talk this has been. I think you'll all join me in thanking Sinead.